She was only 30 years old when her body began to collapse inside the cold stone walls of Wawel Castle, once celebrated for her beauty and her daring defiance of the court. Queen Barbara Radziwiłł now lay motionless on a heavy bed, her skin drained of color, her breath shallow and broken. The crown that had been placed upon her head less than a year earlier rested near her pillow, no longer a symbol of triumph, but of a cruel irony. She had risen higher than anyone expected, and she was about to fall lower than anyone could imagine. Servants whispered outside the door, their voices trembling as they repeated the rumors that had spread through Krakow. Some said the queen was suffering from an incurable disease, a slow rot from within that mocked her once radiant face. Others insisted she had been poisoned, that the hand of her mother-in-law, the infamous Bona Sforza, had tipped a cup with the deadly powders Italians were said to master. The truth was hidden in shadows, but the agony of Barbara was undeniable. Her cries echoed through the corridors, muffled by the thick tapestries, haunting those who dared to listen. In the great halls of the castle, music still played. Nobles gathered, pretending that all was well, while the young queen gasped for life only a few steps away. The contrast was unbearable. A court trying to dance away the scandal while its queen suffered a death more fitting for an outcast than for a crowned consort. How does a queen, the beloved of a king, end like this? How does a woman crowned before the eyes of a nation become a ghost before her time? These questions will lead us through one of the darkest and most tragic love stories of Renaissance Europe. Stay with us until the end of this story. And if you wish to uncover more hidden fates of queens and kings crushed beneath the weight of their own thrones, subscribe now and join us as we reveal the truths history tried to bury. Barbara Radziwiłł grew up in halls that taught discipline as naturally as breathing. Stone corridors smelled of wax and incense. Tapestries showed saints and battles. Gardens bloomed in measured geometry. From childhood, she learned that her smile could charm a room. Yet she also learned that every step was watched and judged. The Radziwiłł name was power, but it was also a harness. Her beauty and her blood were not possessions to keep. They were instruments that others would one day play. At 15, she was promised. At 16, she became a bride. The man was Stanisław Gostod, a magnate whose estates spread across forests and rivers. On the wedding day, incense clouded the church until faces blurred in a holy mist. Pearls weighed on her veil. Gold threads tugged at her sleeves. She spoke the vows as custom demanded. Courtiers admired what they saw. The daughter of Radziwill joined to great wealth. A union as neat as lines upon a map. Inside, a quiet part of her grew still, as if a door had closed and the room beyond had no windows. Life with Stanisław was orderly and correct. Halls rang with feasts, musicians played. Visiting nobles traded compliments and suspicions. Barbara performed the graces that were expected. She smiled at tables set with silver. She greeted guests in velvet and lace. When night settled and the servants withdrew, she would lie awake and watch candlelight tremble on a carved ceiling. Her husband valued her presence as one values a jewel that completes a display. He was not cruel. He was distant in a way that felt like winter. Seasons turned. She learned to move through duty with a calm face. She oversaw households, received petitions, walked the gardens when the court slept. Sometimes she pressed her fingers to the cold stone of a fountain and whispered thoughts that had no listener. She was young in years, but there were mornings when she felt ancient, as if expectation had piled upon her shoulders like snow. Illness came to Stanisław. It arrived quietly and did not leave. when he died. The court praised her fortune. She was young, lovely, and newly powerful as a widow. To Barbara, mourning did not feel like a costume. It felt like a silence that seeped into the walls. Veils softened the world. Footsteps echoed behind her, as if the past kept pace. In the high rooms of Vilnius, she watched the forests darken under the moon and wondered whether her life would fold into a dignified solitude, respected, admired, unloved. Time and widowhood taught her a different hunger. She did not long for another contract, signed by fathers and sealed by priests. She longed to be seen without calculation. She wished for a presence that would hear the voice she had kept hidden for years. It was a private wish, a dangerous wish, a wish she scolded herself for making. A winter night drew the court into the great hall of Vilnius. Torches hammered light into the stone. Lutes and viols braided their voices. Perfume and heat gathered above the dancers like a visible haze. Barbara entered in black and pearl. Conversations wavered. She felt the familiar pull of eyes. She kept her gaze low, her step measured, her breath steady. Then a different gaze found her. It did not skim the surface and move on. It held. She raised her eyes and saw Zygmunt II August, the young king of Poland. He stood among courtiers who nodded and smiled in practiced rhythms. His presence should have been unreachable. Yet within his look, she recognized something intimate and unguarded: loneliness. It matched her own so precisely that for a heartbeat, the music seemed to falter. The hall continued to turn. Dancers passed in glittering circles. Servants moved like shadows along the walls. Barbara and the king did not speak. They did not need to. In that small crossing of sight, she felt a current that belonged to neither reason nor duty. She lowered her eyes, not in fear, but in acknowledgement that the world had tilted. Later, alone at her window, she let the winter air cool her cheeks. Vilnius lay quiet beneath a rim of stars. She understood nothing of plots or outcomes. She understood only that a door she had thought locked forever had shifted. Behind it waited a life that would not be neat, not safe, not quiet. A life that would lift her toward a crown and pull her toward a grave. She closed her eyes and pressed her palm to the glass. The glass held the night. The night held a king who had looked at her as if she were more than a jewel and more than a name. In that knowledge, a flame began to live, small and steady, the kind of flame that can light a throne room and still be hot enough to burn. The secret glances that had begun in Vilnius grew into something far more dangerous. Zygmunt found ways to remain close to Barbara, slipping away from councils, sending notes folded with wax, seeking her in shadowed corridors where only silence could guard them. At first, their words were cautious, nothing more than fragments of conversation carried on hurried breaths. But soon their meetings deepened into confessions, laughter too tender to be hidden, and moments when even the torches seemed to burn brighter for them. For Barbara, every step into this forbidden love was a gamble. She had once been a dutiful wife, then a widow marked by silence, and now she was risking everything for the fire of a king's devotion. When he touched her hand in secret, she felt the walls of her world tremble. When he whispered her name, she no longer heard it as a pawn in some political alliance, but as a woman who had been chosen. She understood the danger, but she also understood that to refuse him would be to return to a life that felt already dead. When Elizabeth of Austria, the frail queen, died, the court's whispers became daggers. Barbara's name was dragged into every corner of Krakow. They called her a witch, a seductress, a woman who had stolen a king's heart with poison rather than affection. Yet Zygmunt's resolve only grew harder. Against the advice of nobles, against the fury of his own mother. He swore that his bond with Barbara would not be broken. Their marriage was sealed in secrecy, in a chapel dim with candle smoke, where prayers were murmured instead of sung. There were no crowds to celebrate, no thunder of bells, only the quiet vow of two people who knew they were binding themselves not only to each other, but to war with a kingdom. Barbara wore velvet and pearls, her face composed, her heart racing. When Zygmunt took her hand, she felt triumph and dread in equal measure. She was now his wife, but also the target of a storm that would not rest. The storm had a name, Bona Sforza. She was the Dowager Queen, mother of Zygmunt, and one of the most formidable women of her age. Born of the Sforza family of Italy, she carried with her both the beauty and the intrigue of the Renaissance. She had survived plots, navigated betrayals, and climbed to the Polish throne with ruthless brilliance. In Krakow, she was both admired and feared. People spoke her name in the same breath as poison, for it was said she understood how to mix it as easily as she mixed alliances. To her, every marriage was a weapon, every union a step toward empire. And to see her son tied not to a Habsburg princess, but to a Lithuanian widow was nothing less than betrayal. Her fury filled the halls like smoke. Barbara could feel it in the glances of servants, in the stiff bows of courtiers, in the heavy silence that followed her steps. Yet she refused to shrink. If Bona's shadow lengthened, Barbara answered with light. She entered feasts in gowns that shimmered, her chin high, her gaze steady. She would not cower, not even when she knew that the eyes upon her wished her downfall. Zygmunt matched her defiance with his own. He stood before the same, his voice carrying through the chamber as nobles pounded their staffs against the floor in outrage. They demanded he end the marriage, erase Barbara from the throne, and restore the honor of the crown. He answered not with compromise but with command. She was his wife, and she would be his queen. In 1550 he forced the final step. Barbara would be crowned Queen Consort of Poland. The day of the coronation, Wawel Cathedral swelled with reluctant witnesses. The air was thick with incense. The choir voices rose beneath arches older than dynasties, and the bells rang with a hollow tone that carried more warning than joy. Barbara entered clothed in brocade and fur, her jewels catching the candlelight like shards of ice. Every step she took seemed to echo with defiance. She could feel the weight of contempt pressing upon her, but she did not falter. At the altar, the crown was lifted high. For a heartbeat, the hall fell into a silence more suffocating than smoke. Then the crown descended, cold metal pressing against her brow. Barbara closed her eyes only briefly, and when she opened them again, she was no longer the widow whispered about in corridors. She was Queen of Poland. Applause followed, thin and forced. The bells of Krakow thundered, but their voices sounded strained, unwilling. Yet Barbara stood radiant, her chin lifted, her gaze unwavering. She was not only the victim of gossip or the target of a dowager queen's fury, she was a monarch crowned, a woman who had claimed her place in defiance of all who wished her erased. It was her peak, her triumph. Yet even in that moment, as she walked out of Wawel beside her husband, she felt the tremor of danger beneath her feet. For every jewel that sparkled on her gown, there was an enemy sharpening a knife in silence. The bells of Wawel had barely stopped ringing when Barbara felt the first chill of her new life. She was queen now, crowned before the eyes of a kingdom. Yet the silence that followed her was louder than the ceremony itself. In the corridors of the palace, servants bowed quickly and kept their eyes lowered, but she noticed how they hurried away as soon as she passed. In the great hall, nobles greeted her with stiff smiles that never reached their eyes. Every gesture of respect seemed to conceal a wound of resentment. At banquets, she sat beside Zygmunt, cloaked in the dignity of her crown. The tables glittered with silver, the air filled with the scent of roasted meats and spiced wine. Yet the laughter of courtiers always fell flat when her name entered the room. Conversations turned quiet when she approached, as if the very sound of her presence spoiled the taste of the feast. She would lift her cup with a steady hand, her eyes sweeping the hall, and see only suspicion mirrored back at her. Whispers multiplied like smoke in the rafters. Some claimed she had used charms to ensnare the king, others that she had poisoned his first wife to clear her path to the throne. The words grew darker with each retelling, until Barbara's name became less that of a queen and more that of a curse. Each rumor carried the same unspoken question: how long before justice, or vengeance, would silence her? At the heart of this storm stood Bona Sforza. She had not raised her voice at the coronation, but her silence was heavier than any cry. She walked the palace in her widow's black, her jewels flashing like shards of ice, her gaze cutting sharper than blades. Wherever she appeared, the air thickened. Courtiers lingered at her side, listening as she spoke of duty, of the disgrace of a kingdom bound to a widow's ambition, of a son blinded by desire. Though Barbara rarely saw her face to face, she felt her presence everywhere. Bona's shadow seemed to stretch into every chamber, every council, every whispered conspiracy. Barbara tried to hold her ground. She appeared in rich gowns, her head high, her voice calm when she addressed those who dared to challenge her. Yet each day it became harder to ignore the isolation closing in. Her allies were few, her enemies countless. Even in the arms of her husband, she sometimes sensed the loneliness pressing against her like stone walls. The question began to repeat itself in her mind, echoing through the corridors where silence had become her constant companion. Why did no one speak for her? Why did the nobles remain mute, even when they knew the venom in their words could destroy her? Why did the king, who had fought so fiercely to crown her, now seem powerless to silence the storm gathering against her? The walls of Wawel glittered with history, but to Barbara they began to feel like a prison. Each tapestry of saints and battles, each window looking down on the city, reminded her of the gaze of a nation that did not accept her. She was a queen, yet each day her throne grew colder, her crown heavier, her future darker. In the days that followed her coronation, Barbara tried to carry herself with the same poise that had defied a kingdom. She attended audiences, listened to petitions, and sat beside Zygmunt during long hours of court. Yet beneath the velvet and pearls, a quiet weariness began to stir. At first it was only a faint heaviness in her legs, a light dizziness when she stood too long beneath the vaulted ceilings of Wawel. She told herself it was nothing, that the strain of the crown weighed on every queen. Still, each evening she felt more drained, her strength ebbing in ways she could not explain. The nobles were quick to notice. They had been watching her every move, waiting for weakness. At banquets, Barbara forced herself to smile, to raise her cup as though nothing had changed. But she ate little, her appetite fading. Servants carried away plates barely touched. Courtiers whispered that the queen had grown pale, her eyes shadowed, her steps slower than before. Some speculated she was with child, Others murmured that God was punishing her for daring to wear a crown not meant for her. Barbara ignored their words, determined not to give them satisfaction. Yet at night, when she lay awake staring at the carved beams above her botte, she felt the unease deepen. Sleep no longer came easily. Her body ached as if weighed down by invisible hands. Her mind restless with thoughts she could not silence. She began to fear the hours of darkness, when the palace grew quiet, and her own frailty spoke the loudest. By the turn of the season, the symptoms sharpened. A sudden cramp would seize her stomach, forcing her to grip the arm of her chair until the pain ebbed. At times, her vision blurred, candle flames wavering into shapes that made her blink and steady herself. She carried these burdens silently, showing Zygmunt only fleeting signs of distress. But within she felt the steady encroachment of something she could not name. The rumors outside her chamber grew harsher, no longer satisfied with whispers of punishment. Some claimed she had been poisoned. They spoke of Italian powders hidden in rings, of drops slipped into honey, of deadly arts carried across the Alps by her mother-in-law. Each retelling grew more elaborate, feeding on the court's hunger for scandal. The phrase Italian poison drifted through corridors like smoke, impossible to pin down yet impossible to ignore. Barbara herself began to feel the shadow of these words. When a goblet of wine was set before her, she hesitated. When fruit was arranged on silver plates, she wondered what unseen hand had touched them. She hated herself for the suspicion, but fear crept into her with every sip, every bite. Even the clear water of Wawel's wells seemed to carry the taste of bitterness. Her body gave her no mercy. The cramps returned more often, sometimes so sharp she pressed her hand against her gown, her knuckles white, praying no one noticed. She grew tired during audiences, struggling to maintain her composure while nobles droned on with petitions. In the privacy of her chambers, she rested more often, sometimes dismissing her ladies abruptly when the pain became too difficult to hide. Zygmunt tried to reassure her. He brought physicians, men with jars of herbs and powders, each prescribing drafts that promised relief. She drank them dutifully, forcing down bitter brews, but none brought more than brief respite. Each morning she awoke still weary. Each evening she retired with the same dull ache gnawing at her. Despite it all, Barbara refused to surrender her dignity. When she appeared in public, she dressed in gowns rich with embroidery, her jewels catching the light, her posture steady. She spoke with a calm voice, hiding the tremor that threatened to betray her. To the watching court, she remained a queen, even as shadows deepened beneath her eyes. But the moment she returned to her chamber, the facade crumbled. She would sink into her pillows, pressing her hands to her stomach, her breaths shallow and uneven. The court sensed what she would not admit. Their whispers grew colder, their glances sharper. They no longer asked if she was unfit. They asked how long she could endure. Barbara Radziwiłł, once radiant and untouchable, was beginning to fade, not yet broken, not yet consumed, but already stepping onto the slope from which there would be no return. By the spring of 1551, physicians no longer spoke with confidence. They circled Barbara's bed with furrowed brows, muttering diagnoses that contradicted one another. Some whispered of a wasting illness, pointing to the relentless bleeding and searing pain that racked her lower body. Others nodded grimly, convinced it was a hidden tumor, the cruelest of afflictions that even queens could not escape. Their words, however, were drowned by the louder chorus outside her chamber. The one that claimed her torment was not disease at all, but the slow venom of poison. The uncertainty was as merciless as the illness itself. Zygmunt leaned over his wife, listening to her ragged breaths, and demanded answers no one could give. He summoned Italian doctors, German surgeons, Polish healers, but each arrived only to shake their heads and offer tinctures that did nothing. Some dared to tell him it was nature, that Barbara's body was devouring itself. Others lowered their voices and hinted at darker causes, careful not to speak too clearly in the presence of the Dowager Queen. Within the palace, silence was more dangerous than words. Courtiers avoided Barbara's rooms, yet they whispered in galleries and stairwells that she had been condemned not by God, but by her own mother-in-law. They spoke of Bona Sforza's reputation in Italy, of families ruined by discreet powders and sudden deaths, of women silenced with drops of clear liquid that left no trace. Each new rumor spread faster than the prayers murmured at Barbara's bedside. Even after her death, Barbara's love story with Zygmunt refused to fade. He had fought nobles, defied the same, and stood against his own mother, all for the woman who had captured his heart. To crown her had been his greatest act of defiance, and to lose her was the wound that never healed. Those who saw him in the days after her passing wrote of a king undone. He would not leave her body, clinging to her lifeless hand until he was forced to let go. It was said that when her coffin was closed, he wept like a child, his cries echoing through Wawel more hauntingly than any bell. Their love had burned bright against the will of a kingdom, yet its light was extinguished before it could warm the future. Together, they had dreamed of children, of a reign shared side by side. Instead, Barbara was lowered into stone at only 30 years of age, and Zygmunt was left to rule with a heart hollowed by grief. The crown he had forced upon her remained, but it gleamed like mockery, a symbol of triumph that had lasted scarcely a year. In the eyes of the people, Barbara became more than a queen. She became a legend of love destroyed by power, a woman who reached for happiness only to be struck down at its peak. To some, she was a martyr of romance. To others, a warning of how dangerous desire could be when it threatened dynasties. And always the question lingered: had she died of illness, or of poison slipped into her veins by unseen hands? Zygmunt never escaped that question. He was said to summon alchemists, even mystics, desperate to see her spirit once more. Whether those stories were true or only whispers, they captured the depth of his devotion. A king could summon armies, yet he could not call back the woman he loved. His throne remained, but it sat heavy, haunted by the memory of a queen who had lived as his greatest passion and died as his greatest sorrow. Centuries later, their story still clings to Wawel's stone walls. Visitors speak of a pale woman in white who wanders the corridors each spring, her gaze searching, her presence filled with longing. Some say she returns not to haunt, but to remember, seeking the man who defied the world for her. Others believe she lingers because her death was unjust, her love unfinished. Barbara Radziwiłł's fate remains a riddle, her story both a romance and a tragedy, a defiance and a defeat. She and Zygmunt stand together in history as lovers torn apart, their bond immortalized not by a happy reign, but by its brutal end. And if you have followed their story to this final moment, do not let it rest in silence. There are more queens who paid for love with their lives, more kings who lost everything to the weight of their own thrones. Stay with us as we uncover those forgotten voices. Like, share, and subscribe. and let Barbara's story guide you into the next shadow of history.